This episode will consist of topics around domestic abuse, domestic violence and sexual violence. If you require any support or help, please get in contact with your local domestic abuse, sexual violence organisation. In the UK, you can call the National Domestic Helpline on 0808 2000 247. And if you are listening overseas, please contact your national helpline where support, advice and guidance will be available for you. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode in A Conversation With. This week I'm joined by a guest, Sue. She can explain her role because I'm sure that I'm going to get it wrong, but she works with children and families that are affected by domestic abuse, particularly kind of what's going on within that family unit, but looking from the child's and from the child's perspective.
So my name's Sue and I work at ESDAS and I'm the Children's Services Team Lead, but I've been here since 2005. So met very many children and families. And my role has always been around working sort of interventions, therapeutic interventions with children. And that includes with their non-abusive parent because it's their family unit they live in.
We're going to look at a concept that seems to just be flying off the shelves at the moment, that seems to be in the news, around parental alienation. And I thought it'd be really cool to have a conversation about that, what that means, what that looks like, is it even a thing, and how dangerous using parental alienation can be with families that are experiencing domestic abuse. The relationship has ended, that person has bravely found the courage to leave that relationship, but how the abuser can still continue the abuse via the family court. So that's where we're going to kind of go today. So Sue, thank you for joining me this week. So Sue, because your expertise is around children and families, and that's why I've invited you onto this week's podcast, because that's not necessarily my expertise as an outreach worker, as an IDFA, as an ISFA. I do all of that high risk stuff right at the beginning that will require some form of intervention, but I don't work with families long term and I don't necessarily work with the children. So thank you again for joining us. You said that you've been Vestas since 2005 and we're now in 2023, and you said that we've had so many changes within organisationally, but I guess there's been a shift in society as well. Would that be fair?
Seen and heard many different stories, everyone really for these children in terms they're now adults, they've got their own families. Statistically, I know there is this thing about 50% go on to be the same as the abusive parent, but it also means 50% don't. Yeah. So there's a bit of a myth, I think, that if you've lived with it, you're going to be in it and have those relationships. Yeah. What we can see is some really positive outcomes where these children that we've worked with have then gone on and they're actually flying now. They've done uni, they're in secure jobs, they have loving relationships. So it's not a given, no.
I think that's a really important positive message to bring, is because you hear these really frightening stories from the media and from other sources that actually people can't be free from that abuse and live healthy lives. Because we do know that domestic abuse does have an impact on children, and especially depending on where they are in their age range, how that can affect definitely through their teens and then their relationships. So actually, I mean, that's a really positive thing that you've just said around, actually, yes, there is a percentage that may go on to exhibit some of those behaviours that is their blueprint from childhood, I guess, is the easiest way to say. But then there are many people that will fight against that as well, to do exactly what you just said, live free lives of abuse in those really healthy relationships. So that's really great. In 2005, we have been talking about parental alienation.
Well, more, so there's always been sort of orders in place in courts and the jurisdiction around everything around that. So that has basically been the same, but obviously we've had a lot more in terms of recognition around DA. domestic abuse in terms of the DA Act that's now there, raising awareness. We do a lot of training to professionals because no one can do this on their own. It has to be a coordinated effort to put the right support in, the right intervention, to allow those abusive partners to be held accountable, and recognising where their power and control and their sense of entitlement, their deeply embedded belief system, attitudes, expectations of what they're looking for is addressed, really. And there are programmes out there for them, but when there's lots of contradictions within systems, processes, practices that make it really hard for victim survivors to actually break free.
And would it be fair to say then, because I'm just speaking from my perspective, that actually those systems, those agencies sometimes don't make it easy for that survivor, so the one that is being abused. So for example, and I get frustrated within my role where the expectation, especially where there is children, tends to lie with the person who's being abused. So as we know, domestic abuse is very, very gendered. So that would mean that it's likely to be mum, who's the primary caregiver. That is likely to be the person within that relationship that is the victim. And then children's services may get involved, for example, because of an incident that's happened, high risk, mum's been hurt, child's been hurt, whatever it is. But then kind of from that moment onwards, agencies are putting quite a lot of responsibility on mum. So mum has to go do a domestic abuse awareness course. Mum has to do a recovery kit with her children. And so she can do all of those things, which is kind of being put upon her. Perpetrator tends to get away with quite a lot, in my opinion. But then family court may have different expectations as well. So mum's trying to keep child safe from the perpetrator. However, and social services may say, actually, child can't have contact with perpetrator. But then you've got a family court that is saying, actually, no, you need to facilitate contact.
So a good way of explaining that, actually, is a model that has been developed by Marianne Hester in 2009, and it's called the 3 Planets model, and it's this interrelationship between the domestic abuse and child abuse. That's sort of where it's come from, and showing that each planet has its own history, culture, and laws. So, a brief explanation of this. So you've got a domestic abuse planet, and then on that planet sits police, the criminal court, civil and criminal laws, there's orders, there's bail conditions, and what that planet serves to do is provide intervention and support to the survivor. So they're brave enough to call the police, they do their statements, they support the prosecutions, and that's where that planet sits, and that's who lives on that planet. Then you've got a child protection planet. Now, who sits on that? Social workers, it's public law. They've got a statutory duty to protect the children and the carers. The focus is very much the child and about sort of meeting that child's needs. Now, in that situation, you get the mother is responsible for protecting that child and has to face the consequences. So that mum could be told, you need to leave that relationship because your child is suffering and that's what we're focusing on. So it's your responsibility to do that. That's what basically happens in the rules on that planet. So the mother then can feel to blame for the abuse that isn't her fault. And so she's failing to protect her children. That's the sort of narrative that comes out of that. The dad is invisible, disappears out the picture because it's all down to the resident parent. Then the third planet is the child contact planet. So in that one, we've got CAFCAS, family courts, very pro-contact child contact, saying that the child needs to have contact with both parents. Doesn't necessarily talk to the criminal court.
Right.
So in that one, it's private law. Okay. They're not talking to each other. So where you got the difficulties on that planet is that CAFCAS will get involved and do their assessments. What they're looking for is good enough good enough parenting, because the premise is that children need to have contact with both parents. Where you've got DA in the picture, that isn't always true.
Yeah.
So where it gets difficult for mum is that mum's trying to protect the child from the abuse by calling the police, doing what she needs to do there. It goes to children's services, so she leaves the relationship because that's what she's told to do. She goes to family court, and there's a child arrangement order, and the child is ordered to go to the person she's trying to protect that child from.
Which is a total contradiction. Of keeping
conundrum.
that child safe. Yeah.
Where it's a no-win.
Yeah.
It's a no-win. Then when you've got parent alienation...
So let me just stop there then. Is parental alienation an actual thing?
Okay, so where it came from in the 1980s, it was this concept of parental alienation syndrome, introduced by this American psychologist, Richard Gardner, because he had this thing about refuting mothers' claims of child abuse. So again, the thing that it was focused around mothers immediately gives you the inference that it's more pro-dad, right? This concept of a syndrome was completely discredited and rejected, okay? But the idea was then set in people's heads of, oh, what's this parental alienation? Okay. And worldwide has been taken on. Some countries have since banned it because there's no robust evidence, there's no empirical studies or anything that sort of provide enough gumption, really, to give it what it should have. However, it has been taken on. So where you've got separating parents, generally separating parents, and there might be, problems in that, they go to court, they're trying to sort things out, it could be used. However, where you've got domestic abuse and you've got an abuser who is very subtle and skilled at coercive controlling behaviours, this is another tool that is used. Because what happens is that, so where you've got your mum that's already in their no-win situation, shut down to be able to disclose anything, particularly around coercive control, because if they haven't reported it, and where's the evidence? We know it's now a crime, but if they haven't done that, and there isn't the evidence to back anything up, and she might be trying to withhold her child from contact because there is a danger, going in breach of an order that's set, say, then what will happen is it will be seen as you're trying to alienate, and the word is used. What it actually does is draw the focus away from any allegation of domestic abuse and focus on the mum as having mental health issues, trying to turn the child away from their dad. Because
is there a similarity or even a difference between what is seen as parental alienation, so a perpetrator saying that the mother, for example, is using every method for him not to have a relationship with his child, and estrangement? Do you know what I mean? Is there similarities or differences, or is it kind of part of the same thing?
So, well, the Kafka's definition for parental alienation is when a child is resistance or hostility towards one parent is not justified and is the result of psychological manipulation by the other parent. Okay? It's not a UK law.
Right.
So it's for dealing with it. There's no UK law for dealing with it. No, there is no law. But other definitions also include the phrase without good reason.
Okay.
Now, I think we'd all agree that if there was domestic abuse in there and that child was being harmed, that's a good reason.
Yeah.
But it's proving it. And this is where the difficulty lies. It's the evidence within it, because the premise for courts is that it's in the child's best interest to have positive contact with both parents. So stopping contact should only be considered when it is clear that it's not in the child's best interest. Now we're down to clarity. How do you get the clarity? We're back to exposing the DA that happens behind closed doors, particularly if it's a lot more around the coercive control. And it's the rules, the routines of that person. Those children have lived with it. They know what it is. They know they're walking on eggshells. they're looking over their shoulder, they're, can I do this, can I do that, the goalpost moves, all of those things that we know that happen for children.
So would it be fair to say then that this non-concept of parental alienation is in actual fact, where we're talking about domestic or sexual violence, another tool that a perpetrator will use in order to continue that abuse?
Yeah, definitely. And Emma Katz, actually, in her book that she's written, she's defined this tactic that's used under the letters of DARVO.
Yeah.
So the D is they deny there's any abuse. The A is that they attack the credibility and the character of the survivor. And they can do that through allegations of alienation.
Right.
Because what it does is counter-allegate if a survivor's trying to say there's domestic abuse here, this is what this person did, then they will go straight into the allegation, the counter-allegation. And then the R in this DARVO stands for they reverse the narrative. So what it immediately does, because it's so embedded in professional practices all over, is at the moment the alienation word is used, oh, right, let's look at that. And it refocuses away, before that survivor's been even able to tell their story, and they can't do that if they're shut down by all this coercive control, and their sort of space for action is completely closed down, as is the children. So you're left with, well, who's the victim, who's the offender, who's the safe person, who isn't? And then that's another conundrum that they're trying to work out. So that gets confusing. So in the court system, what judges need to use is a direction, 12J.
Okay. And what is that?
So in that, it came out of, it's come from government, but it sort of came out of the 19 child homicide study that was done with Women's Aid.
Okay. And for our listeners, what is a child homicide? And what, like, obviously not going into graphic details, but an overview, what does that actually mean?
A child death.
Okay, so a child has been killed as a result of the violence, the domestic abuse.
So in this study, it was from 2005 to 2015, and they looked at serious case reviews from child deaths in England and Wales. And there was 19 of these that they looked at. And in there, these deaths were caused by the fathers who were also perpetrators of domestic abuse. So they killed their children, and they were also perpetrators. So let me just make sure that I've got that right in my head, because again, this is not my skill, which is why you're here. 19 were identified that actually that the child was killed by the abusive perpetrator. And do we know if those children... And it was during their contact, so it was either formal or informal.
Okay, so that was what was going to lead on to my question then. So was those court-ordered contacts?
Some of them were.
Okay.
Yeah, the formal ones would have been under a court-ordered.
Yeah.
So, in other words, judges were making decisions, we're back to the planets, aren't we? The judges were making decisions, not recognising the domestic abuse, and making those decisions, those children were going and were killed. And because of that study, then came out this direction, this practice direction, 12J. So what that now says, and sadly always comes out of when there's something terrible that happens, there's some change. Yeah. So these directions were that judges, to give them what they need to do if there's an allegation of domestic abuse in the court when they're looking at child arrangements. Now, in it, and again, there's another contradiction, because in the direction, what it says is that when there's an allegation, what the judge needs to do is order a fact-finding hearing before anything happens around, let's look at what these parents are saying they want to happen. So in order to do that, they then get CAFCAS to go in and do their little bit. Another reform around that is, and again has come out of horrible things, is that what CAFCAS need to do is a child's impact report.
So before we kind of go further, for the listeners that don't know what CAFCAS is, what is CAFCAS?
Oh, CAFCAS stands for Child and Family Court Advisory Support Service. It could also be NIAS, who are the National Youth Advocacy Service, and their job is then to do an assessment on the capacity and appropriateness of what happens with the children. The very first report, because the judge will be wanting that before they make any considerations around anything, but sometimes they weren't even seeing the children. It was based on phone contacts with the parents to gather what was going on for them. Because of changes and looking at, no, that wasn't good enough, they now do a more thorough child impact report, which should include directly talking to the children. It should also include any other services that have been involved. It should include talking to DA services. We don't really have that contact with CAFCAS, to be honest, but that's what it should have in there. And then from that, the judge needs to make those decisions before making any contact arrangement orders or anything. They should have those decisions, all of that reporting, so that they can look at then what comes under the welfare checklist, which is what judges look at. In that, it's all about the emotional, the physical, every side of the child. Are their needs being met? In amongst that is also dependent on their age and their environments. All of those things are supposed to be considered.
But from my position, yes, this should be happening. But from my experience, it doesn't happen. We're not getting involved in, well, definitely from an IDFA perspective, we're definitely not getting involved in or being included in those family court preparations. And I think that it's fair to say that sometimes the family court gets it wrong. But equally, what I've noticed is that with a criminal court, if a perpetrator was to go to a criminal court for, let's say, ABH, GBH, they tend to be open courts. So any member of the public can kind of go to, like, I believe in most cases, can go to court and have access to the gallery. There will always be a press reporter. That's not the same for family courts.
No, because it's private. It's private law. So it's not public. It's not criminal court. It's the private bit, which, is really tricky. So, because then what you end up with, if there's or the criteria for the evidence isn't met for there to be this allegation is true, then what they do is they send the parents to mediation.
Yeah.
Now, we know that survivors of domestic abuse can be exempt from mediation because all it does is give a forum for that abuser to continue, and the survivor then is forced to make decisions they don't want to do. But they can only be exempt if it's evidenced that there's domestic abuse. So we're all back to that again. Just being able to say it isn't enough. However, you can say there's an allegation of parent alienation without any evidence for it, and it's believed. You can say there's alleged domestic abuse. Well, where's the evidence? How many police reference numbers have you got? I'm worked with a mum who's been in and out of the court system for years, and she was an expert, was then ordered to do a psychological assessment on both mum and dad because of this parent alienation allegation. And although in this expert's background, there was supposed to be some knowledge of domestic abuse, the question to mum was, well, because you didn't report it to the police, I don't think it happened. And it was so shocking. Yeah. It was so shocking.
That's victim blaming at its finest, isn't it?
Well, and so she was in a no-win situation.
Well, I've got a case actually where the relationship was extremely abusive, lots and lots of coercive control. She found the courage to report. She found the courage to leave. In actual fact, she ended up going to refuge for a little while and things settled down. But from that perspective, she was still, full-time mum to these children. And then he wanted to punish her because she had reported and she dared to leave him, and he went through the family court system and so many times under this pretense of parental alienation, and actually all she was doing was trying to keep her children safe. And then he successfully won that court case, and her children are now living with him full time, and she's had no contact with her kids for 3 years because of that parental alienation, because that's exactly what that perpetrator has done. He's accused her of parental alienation, where he's not allowed to see the children, but actually successfully he's done exactly what he accused her of, and she's had no contact, no phone contact. He will fraught that she doesn't have money to go to family court every year or whatever it is. And it's really sad to see that the real impact of that, of working with families, and going back to what you said right at the beginning, there's a huge amount of people that will go on to do X, Y, and Z, but there's a huge amount that don't. And if you've got this family court system and you've got contact, and it's no wonder, it's no wonder that it's really hard for children to escape and emotionally be free from that continual cycle of manipulation and gaslighting.
Yeah, definitely. Because there's, in all of this, I mean, the focus should be on the child.
Yeah.
Child arrangement orders should be there for the child. It's not there for a parent to pick and choose when they're going, oh, well, I'll break it today and I'll keep it tomorrow. It's the child. And yet that child's voice is shut down when courts make child arrangement orders. They say they listen to the child, they send in CAFCAS or whoever, and they say, yes, it's the welfare checklist, we're looking at all of these things. But if we look at it, so we've got children that are experiencing and exposed to whatever that abuse looks like in that home. They're living it as well. We've got rid of, thank goodness, this thing, oh, children are upstairs in their bedroom, they're not affected. Yeah, no, they are. They hear it. And children will say to me, the most worrying thing is when there's an argument and it's all kicking off, and that's awful, and you can hear it, and they're frightened and they're trying to concentrate on their PlayStation or whatever. The moment it gets really scary for them is when it goes quiet.
Yeah.
Because they don't know if their mum's alive or not. And that's when it gets scary. And they're living with this. They're living with the rules and the routines and everything that goes on in that home, and it's always one person's way, my way, no way. That's what they're living with. So it then becomes, say they're 8 or 9, and then CAFCAS are asking them what they want. And if they're saying, I don't want any contact with that person, I don't want to see them, I'm too frightened of them, I don't want that. Often that gets overridden, and they're told they've got to go to contact because they're too young to understand, and that must be manipulated by the other parent. And yet they're not too young to be in that situation and experiencing it.
And children, what is the age of legal responsibility? It's 10. By the age of 10, what is right and wrong? And actually, by the age of 10, I think that you are quite capable of knowing what it is that you want to do. And if...
Yeah, it's almost not validating. They know how they feel. They know, and they'll always describe it as the look. So there's not even any words. And then how do you describe that? Well, how do you that they're scary? Well, it's the look. Well, we know what that means because it's in everybody's story. But they won't even say it. And also, if they are given contact, they've also got to think, if I disclose what my life is really like and how it is, I've then got to go and see that person. What's going to be the repercussion of me saying? So they just close down. And that's what it does. It shuts them down. It doesn't leave the door open for them to have a choice.
So what I think this is going to be too big of a question, really, but what needs to happen? Because what I want to do is, obviously, in this is highlight what it is, just so people are aware of it, so we can start having a conversation. I've said on previous episodes, these episodes are not to necessarily give answers, it's to start a conversation.
Yeah.
So if you feel that you're affected, if you feel that there's anything that you're hearing now via what Sue is kind of narrating, and you want to know more about that, reach out to your local organisation to talk about that, because these don't necessarily give all of the answers. It's just to initiate conversations. So in your opinion,
well, there are things happening. Okay. So let's hope. I'm always hopeful. Let's hope there's light at the end of the tunnel, because actually in government they are recognising that this needs to change.
Good.
So there is I think it started, there's a pilot scheme where certain courts around England and Wales are part of this pilot scheme where they're looking at what are the experiences of survivors and children through that court system to look at where is it working, where is it not. They've got things in place, they've got these directions, they've got organisations, they've got facilities out there, there's support services. So they're looking at what's going wrong, why are these things happening, why are children dying, all of those things. So the other thing they're now questioning around the parent alienation is this whole thing about this pseudo-scientific phenomena, and also these so-called experts that are used in courts. They're unregulated. What qualifications do they have to start putting in these reports that judges are relying on and making decisions on? So they're looking at that. And I think United Nations are in on that as well.
Okay.
Something they're all saying about we've got to get rid of this. Parent alienation starts post-separation because that's when the allegation starts. They're using it as a tool to continue their abusive behaviours, using this coercive controlling way, the tactics that they use of doing it. So there are things, this pilot scheme, there's this more thorough thing with Kafkas that's supposed to be happening. We've got these directions. So, and I think Jess Phillips in Labour, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah,
she's right on it.
Jess Phillips is a massive advocate for women and girls and
she's
violence.
Right on it.
And she's really advocating.
It's like a dog with a bone with it, and she's not going to let that rest. And so there will be reforms, I think. They are noticing it. There will be reforms. So anybody thinks that they can hide behind that alienation, I'm going to use it, I think the time's limited.
And that's good. That's really good. And I thank you so much for shining a bit of a light on that. And I'm sure that we could speak hours and hours about it. But what I'd like to kind of just briefly kind of talk about, because obviously you do work with children and families, and that's where your niche is that I want to kind of give a bit of a positive message that there is support out there for your children, because I know that you have run some recovery programs. If you could give any advice to the victim parent of how to help their child right now that the relationship has ended, that they're no longer living in that home, is there any advice that you could give to those parents to help their children with that, feeling safe in the home, that kind of stuff? Because I know that you are amazing within the children's work and those programs that you have delivered. And I think that I really want to just kind of, because it has been quite heavy, the subject that we're talking about, and rightly so, but actually some of those things that parents can do right now to keep their children safe. It's a really horrible journey, but there are things. Because I know that you've done some incredible work.
It is, because those non-abusive parents, they're having to sort of deal with their own stuff around it. They're becoming a single parent when the rules have never been theirs to follow. They're having to find their way, and I think there's a tendency just to hope and pray that the children will be okay. And they might look like that, they might be acting out, they might be internalising it, whatever it is, they are going to be struggling with it too. I think communication is a good thing. Be open about it. Don't feel frightened to talk to your children about what's happened, because it's happened to them too. That's not about going into graphic detail about the stuff, or it's not denigrating another parent in any way, shape or form, but it's not trying to hide behind just assuming they're okay, because they're not okay. And it's perfectly fine to say, have a good old cry about it. Or get support, reach out to get that. There are the programmes that are out there, and they work with the mums and the children together to look at opening that communication in a safe way and exploring. Really, for mums, it's not a parenting programme at all, and it looks at really for mum walking in your child's shoes for a bit and just sort of considering what are they going through. I mean, an example of something quite every day that we hear would be that a child can't sleep, and so they're up all night and they're in and out of mum's bed, and that can be very frustrating when mum's trying to settle them. And then when we talk to mum, we sort of say, well, think of the history, think of the story. When was the abuse happening? Oh, well, the children had gone to bed and the arguments would ensue, there'd be things thrown about and all of that was going on. those children probably would have heard it. And so nighttime for them, when it's quiet, even though that person's not in the home anymore, is a scary place to be. So it's just trying to make those associations with what might be going on for that child, and then how they can then try and think, right, do we change the room around, or do we do different lighting? Do we do different routines around bedtime? What can be made better for that child? What does that child need that's going to help them feel safer?
And I think that's really important, because actually, just to pick up on what you said, and in an earlier episode where we looked at what domestic abuse in children can look like, is that as adults we often don't know what's happening, often can't find the words, and children, they just definitely don't have that language, but they have the emotions, they have that feeling. And actually, child getting up in the middle of the night or bedwetting, that is a sign of they're a little bit vulnerable, they're a little bit scared, they might be worried about that parent, exactly that silence. So actually having some soft music or white noise or something for in those early days at the very least. And there's lots of books out there that you can find via Amazon or other bookshops to support your child with that emotional recovery.
One of the programs that we run is the Healing Together program.
Yeah.
And that looks at more around how your body is responding. And so you don't talk about the domestic abuse at all. You don't sort of go into any of the trauma stuff. But what it's looking at is how your body's responding. So where's the anxiety? Where does that feel in your body? What's it like? What are you calling it? Things like that. And then mums can also do the same program, and it's looking at ways of trying to find ways to calm, find ways to notice what's going on before it gets too overwhelming. So it could be if they're suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, it can hit them anytime. A smell, a sound, a look, anything. So it's noticing, trying to get them to start to recognise, oh, I'm starting to sweat, or I'm getting hot. It's finding a way of them recognising where those stress things are. So then, okay, what's going to help? Let's think about your breathing.
Okay.
Let's recognise what that is. Let's find, in the moment, let's find a way to calm. Because we know that a child, so if they're in school and something happens and they look out the window and there's a car very similar to whatever, and there's a situation that they triggered, then it's how are they going to feel calm? Because what they're not doing is learning. They're not going to be listening. They're not going to be looking at. They're going to be hyper vigilant around their environment because they're looking for danger. Yeah. So they're either going to want to shoot that room and go, or they're going to suffer in silence and sit there. Yeah. So it's helping them to find a way. Oh, I'm starting to panic. I'm panicking. What do I need to do? I need to breathe. I need to think. And then you work with schools and they can give exit cards or whatever it is. And that's where we need to work together as teams to offer the best interventions to these children.
Would it be fair to say that if has found that bravery to leave that abusive relationship, that actually the children, you need to kind of do that together, that healing, because children are going to be in the house, even if that you are protecting your children as much as possible while the children don't see anything, they just hear. Actually bringing them along with the journey of going, actually it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be nervous, even I as the parent or whatever get scared as well, and kind of being age appropriate, but bringing them, rather than kind of going, oh okay, well you're little, you're resilient, everything is great.
And I think because going back to where we were at the beginning, sort of saying about whether it's alienations, whether it's if they're involved in children's services and feeling to blame, that's where those parents get shut down to feel confident to have those conversations, because what they don't want is it to come back at them and say, well, that's your fault. So they tend to be silent and hope that by sending their child off to a service that's going to support them, they're going to get mended and bring them back when they're mended. But actually the journey in rebuilding is with both of them. So, and that's quite a big ask for a mum if she thinks that I'm all right, I'm actually okay now, they've gone, I'm dealing with it, oh, it's my child that's the problem. And particularly another one that children will say is the one thing that hits them the hardest is if ever they're told, you're just like your dad.
Yeah.
And they might look like them.
Yeah.
There might be a behaviour, a mannerism or something. Well, they're children, but they're children in their own right. They're not that person. And that doesn't mean to say they're going to go on and be that person. Well, the children will say it's the worst thing that they can be told.
So it's been amazing, and we could speak for hours, but thank you so much for joining in this week's conversation. If you want to know more, if you are looking for support for your children, please do your research, what your local agency offers. There are organisations such as your Outreach, your ISVAs, your IDVAs, where there may be specific support for your child, but it's worth inquiring about that. Thank you so much again, Sue. It's been amazing having you on this week and just talking. I can just see your passion. You're just so knowledgeable, which is why I wanted you on just to talk about it a little bit more. So thank you. And you've just listened to this week's episode. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation this week. Feel free to like, share, subscribe so you don't miss out. And I'll see you next time.